amazing. You responded. I'm very touched. Let me welcome you to the Bentham Lecture for this year, 2008. It's been organised by the Humanist Association, the Humanist Philosophers indeed, and also by University College London, the Department of Philosophy. In a few moments or minutes, in fact, our Bentham Lecture will be introduced by our chairman. Our chairman is lurking behind me here at the moment. But humanists are ever so polite. So they think, well, if we're going to have the lecturer introduced, someone should introduce the chairman. So I'm introducing the chairman. Of course, were the humanists really polite, then someone would introduce me and so on. That might lead, though, to the great supreme divine introducer. And Jeremy Bentham would not approve. So, let me introduce the chairman. The chairman is Professor Jonathan Wolfe, Joe Wolfe of University College London, philosopher indeed, who writes eminent works on political philosophy. I am the humble Peter Cave, who belongs to the Humanist Philosophers group. I think some years ago, Joe and myself and other humanists and so on, we thought it would be very useful to celebrate the name of Bentham by running this series of lectures. Bentham was he was a nice chap. He was a social reformer, he was a political theorist, he was a legal theorist and so on, and as I said, he was pretty nice. It also seems very appropriate to have the Bentham Lecture Series associated with the University College London, because Bentham was the guiding spirit behind setting up the University of London in 1832. That was very important in those days because at the time no other university in Great Britain would allow you to study or teach unless you were some sort of Christian or wore some sort of Christian badge. Jeremy Bentham wore no Christian badge. In fact, University College London, strangely or not, a few decades later, not merely allowed in non-Christians, they also allowed in women. So it was really moving ahead of its time. That's my plug for University College London. Did I do my bit, Joe? Yeah. I should also do a plug for humanism, but I'm sure at heart all of you are humanists in any case. Jeremy Bentham, though, was a social reformer, as I said. He was also quite a courageous social reformer. For example, in the late 18th century, early 19th century, it was highly illegal. You could be sent to prison for many years to engage in homosexual activities. Bentham argued for the repeal of those laws. In one of Bentham's quips, he said, "Why shouldn't people be allowed to scratch where it itches?" Bentham, you probably know, is associated with the greatest happiness of the greatest number. In fact, another expression often thrown at him is that he said that pushpin could have as much value, or maybe more value, than poetry. That seemed to upset. Pushpin was a child's game. That seemed to upset John Stuart Mill, who otherwise was a great admirer of Bentham, and some of you may know Mill said, "It is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig." How true, dear John Stuart Mill. Think philosophers, maybe. There's a scurrilous rumour, though, that the child's game pushpin was in fact a euphemism for sexual activities. And so maybe Bentham was right after all. Though John Stuart Mill would still disagree. If you read his writings, you'll see that he does. On that note, though, I won't pass you on to any pushpin, I assume. Well, not in the next hour or two, but who knows later on. But I will pass you on to our chairman.
It's my great pleasure to introduce another brave man, a man who has had many controversial views and may perhaps also do that this evening. Jonathan Glover is probably still associated in most people's minds with Oxford, I imagine. But for 10 years or so, he was a professor and director of the Centre for Medical Law and Ethics at King's. King's was all right too. It was founded in opposition to the godless college in Gower Street. In fact, we were pretty God-fearing most of the time. It is one of the great myths of UCL that it was founded by atheists. It was founded by atheists and nonconformists who were a very unhappy group together for many years. Jonathan, it's no exaggeration to say, is one of the world's leading moral philosophers. His publications date back a long time. His first book, Responsibility, was published, I'm not going to say when, quite a while ago. He's the author of a number of classic works: Causing Death and Saving Lives, What Sort of People Should There Be, I, The Philosophy and Psychology of Personal Identity, Humanity, not humanism, but Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, and most recently, Choosing Children, The Ethical Dilemmas of Genetic Intervention. His talk tonight, we think, is called, we couldn't remember exactly what it was called, but between us I think we've reconstructed the title, Terrorism, Human Rights and Torture. John. It's off. I think it's okay.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? That's good. Joe, thank you very much for that introduction, Joe and Peter. I'm very pleased to be here. I've always actually had quite a fellow feeling for University College. I've been coming to visit friends in the philosophy department for many years. And I have been very happy at King's, but I must say the one moment when I had any doubts about going to King's was when somebody, when I was still in Oxford, said, well, I'm really glad you're not going to join the godless in Gower Street. And I suddenly thought that, is King's really my sort of place, so it's contrasted with the godless in Gower Street. It's nice to see you all this evening, but I have to say that I am not deceived. When I was a younger lecturer, I used to imagine when I saw an audience of people, especially if they looked interested, I would imagine that they were all really interested in what I had to say. But over the years, I've gradually learned that this appearance can be deceptive. My most vivid memory of this was when I was lecturing once in the United States. And I'd been asked to go and lecture on Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. And I was in the middle of, towards the end of it, I was talking about some of Tolstoy's values, including what I call his idea of seriousness, that for Tolstoy it's hugely, he doesn't much admire people who are saying things to be clever or smart or to advance their careers or to be fashionable. He likes people who push through the conventions and talk about things that really matter to them. And I was applauding this. And I saw a young man looking as though he was really taken with this, and so I was rather pleased. And I thought my visit to America hadn't been in vain. Afterwards, at the drinks, he came up to me, and I was a little disappointed when he had an English accent, because I'd really gone there to wow those Americans. But I was also a little disturbed when he said, there's something I'd like to talk to you about, if I may. And I suddenly thought that I'd been saying this stuff about seriousness, pushing through to the things you really care about. And I quite like it if people come out as gay or whatever it is, but I'd like to have known them more than about 5 minutes. And I with some trepidation, I said, well, do tell me. And he said, well, there's a thing which has been really a problem for me in the year I've been in the United States. And I said, what's that? And he said, do you know McVitie's home wheat chocolate biscuits? And it turned out that he couldn't get them. But when he'd fixed his eye on me with such intent gaze during the lecture, it hadn't actually been Tolstoy's idea of seriousness. He'd seen me as just the sort of person he could plausibly persuade to send him a packet of So anyway, we had that bit of conversation, and I did indeed, when I got back to England. And there are two kinds. There's milk chocolate, plain chocolate, and I got him several packets of each. And I put them in a package and went off to the post office to post them. This dates the story a bit. You could get several packets for about £5. And I then found that having spent £5 on the biscuits, for them to arrive not stale, I would have to send them by airmail. And that cost about £15. So it was an incredibly inefficient thing. And he obviously felt guilty about this because some months later, a little package arrived for me with some American biscuits in it, which must have cost about $5 and must have cost him about $15 of postage. The only merit of this transaction is that it refutes that dismal economist's picture of us as all rational, self-interested. I want to start, having started mildly lightly, I have to apologise for the fact that the talk is going to be a little on the dark side. I mean, with the word torture in it, you might have suspected that. It's a strange thing. I haven't got a psychoanalyst, but if I did have, they might be able to unearth why. I think I'm normally rather a cheerful sort of person, and I often seem to write or talk on rather dark topics. So anyone who wishes to leave now, do feel free to do so. Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, who's always been a kind of hero of mine, though I was a bit sorry that he turned out to be quite so lacking in bravery about his views on gay sex. On the other hand, I'm rather glad that he concealed the views on torture that I'm about to talk about in a minute or two. Bentham was very sceptical about human rights. When we think about human rights, we, I think, rightly think that they don't depend on the legal system of any particular country. The point of things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention and so on, is that the claim is that people, just in virtue of being human beings, have certain rights. And that's so even if the legal system of Burma or wherever it is doesn't recognise them. Bentham was sceptical about the idea of human rights, natural rights as he called them, partly because he thought that rights couldn't be prior to law as they needed to be enforced. But he also said, talk of natural rights is simple nonsense, and imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. And he went on to say that to talk of natural rights was like talking of a species of cold heat, a sort of dry moisture, a kind of resplendent darkness. And he went on to say, with marvellous rhetoric, few philosophers these days writing their careerist articles in mind actually would refer to an opposing view as he did. He said, such talk is the effusion of a hard heart operating on a cloudy mind. I think there are real intellectual problems about rights. I have a love-hate relationship with rights because if, on the one hand, it does seem plausible to say that some things are so precious, so important for human beings leading a decent life, that these things ought to be given priority over less important benefits to other people. But on the other hand, I think it's very difficult to do without rights or some idea like rights. But on the other hand, there's a real intellectual problem. On what basis do we decide that something is a right? How do we decide what gets on the list? I think that things like the right not to be tortured, the right not to be arbitrarily arrested, the right to freedom of speech, I think these are highly plausible. But as one goes down the list, is there a right to 6 weeks maternity leave? Somewhere you get to a kind of borderline area. And there's the famous thing in recent years that Ronald Dworkin has said, talking about rights. He said that a good way of thinking of them is to think of rights as like trumps in a card game. Rights trump other considerations. If you have a very strong interest in something, but I have a right to it, then my right overrides your mere interest, however great your interest is. But I think there's a real question as to whether it's easy to defend a sharp boundary between these two tiers that a rights theory seems to require. Anyway, with Bentham's scepticism about rights in general outside those conferred by a legal system, and his scepticism in particular about natural rights, or as we might say, human rights. It's perhaps a bit unsurprising that he was fairly scathing about people who thought that there should be an absolute prohibition on the use of torture. And he had various arguments to support the view that torture could sometimes, under very controlled conditions, be justified. He firstly said that he would extrapolate from cases of torture where nobody suspects it to be wrong. And he gives an example which he realizes people wouldn't ordinarily think of as torture, but says that by the definition of torture it is. He says, a parent whose child obstinately refuses to ask a question and who whips him until he complies, Bentham says, well, we all think that's all right. He says that this is neither more nor less than torture. Now, of course, there he's showing his historical period. I am pleased to say that when I was at school, in the dark ages when I was young, when at our school we used to get caned for this and that, I remember arguing against this mode of punishment by saying it's a form of torture. So in other words, I agree with Bentham, but simply want to run the argument the other way, saying that that kind of thing, whipping a child is fine, therefore torture must be okay. I want to say, yes, it is torture, but that's one of the reasons why it's not okay. Then again, Bentham says that then torture may cause less overall pain than less drastic but longer lasting means of coercion, for instance imprisoning someone until he talks, whereas torture can stop as soon as it succeeds and the person talks. He gives an example of where we might use torture, and he says if you imagine two men caught setting a house on fire, and you manage to keep one, but the other gets away. And so the one you keep, he says, it's maybe a very sensible policy to torture him until he names his accomplice, so that his accomplice can be arrested. Now the idea being, you should remember that Bentham was living in a day when not all houses were wooden, but many were. He was writing only about 100 years after the Great Fire of London, which would be as much in their memory as, say, the Great War is in ours. And in a way, this example that it's okay to do this to stop some huge catastrophe, like arson that will then cause a fire that might burn down the whole town, this is a precursor of the much discussed ticking bomb argument that's often used these days by people who want to justify torture. If we found that there was a group of terrorists who put a ticking bomb under London somewhere, under New York or under Paris, if we knew that the ticking bomb was there, and we'd caught one of the people, and he had the information we needed to stop it and wouldn't give it to us, then the argument by defenders of torture is that we would be entitled to torture because torturing one person is so much less bad than, say, a nuclear bomb going off in a major metropolis. And Bentham's argument is, I think, pretty clearly the precursor, the first simple version of this kind of argument. Now, I turn only very briefly to terrorism. What I want to discuss centrally is something like the ticking bomb argument, the argument that we may be justified, as people believed, the people who set up Guantanamo clearly believed, we may be justified in torturing people in order to prevent a terrorist outrage that will involve very many deaths. And I want to make a couple of points about terrorism in general. One point about I am in general against terrorism, but then I'm in general against conventional war as well. But I'm often uneasy about the very sharp distinction that's sometimes drawn simply on the basis of whether something is done by an official army or done by an unofficial group. There's in St. Augustine's City of God, he reports a dialogue that's supposed to have taken place between a pirate and Alexander the Great. Augustine says this: "The king asked the fellow, 'What is your idea in infesting the sea?' The pirate answered with uninhibited insolence, "The same as yours in infesting the earth. But because I do it in a tiny craft, I'm called a pirate. Because you have a mighty navy, you're called an emperor." And I think there is a deep truth in that story. I don't want to encourage terrorism, but I'm not all that keen on encouraging wars by conventional armies either. But I think that it should be said that the objections to terrorism should centrally be about random targeting of civilians and so on, using unnecessary force, there being other means of achieving good causes, or sometimes that it's devoted to a bad cause. Those are the central objections that are worthwhile. The objection that it isn't carried out by an official army seems to me to be unimportant. Well, I believe one of the great pieces of self-deception we have in thinking about the ethics of violence is the idea that if it's ordered by some general in uniform, then somehow that's okay, whereas if it's a hole-in-corner affair of some conspirators, then that can't possibly be. It's not that I'm trying to push for more terrorism, I'm trying to make for more skepticism about conventional war. The second thing I want to say is just something briefly about the current so-called war on terror, the current terrorism and its opposition, the so-called war on terror. And I want to suggest that these are both sides, what bin Laden did and what George W. Bush did, are both seen as part of a cycle of violence that's linked to humiliation in particular. Let's take bin Laden first. About a month after 9/11, bin Laden made a statement broadcast on Al Jazeera. He said, "What America is tasting today is but a fraction of what we have tasted for decades. For over 80 years, our Ummah has endured this humiliation and contempt. Its sons have been killed, its blood has been shed, its holy sanctuaries have been violated, all in a manner contrary to that revealed by God, without anyone listening or responding. But when after 80 years the sword comes down on America, the hypocrites rise up to lament these killers who've scorned the blood, honor, and holy places of Muslims." And I think that sense of humiliation and contempt, to use his words, often leads to a backlash. People who feel humiliated then often want to hit back at the people they think are humiliating them. And well before 9/11, bin Laden saw terrorist attacks as a retaliation that would expunge the sense of humiliation. In 1997, he said of some terrorist attacks on Americans, "They have wiped disgrace and submissiveness off the forehead of their nation." And later on, after 9/11, he said about the 9/11 bombers, "They rubbed America's nose in the dirt and wiped its arrogance in the mud. It became clear to people that America, this unjust power, can be struck down and humiliated." Now, it wasn't just bin Laden who acted partly out of the backlash against humiliation. I think after 9/11 there was a huge sense in the United States of humiliation also. The apparently impregnable United States suddenly had been hit in a very powerful, horrible, symbolic way. Not only was there huge grief at the cruel deaths of many of their citizens, and many citizens of other countries like ours, but there was also a sense of humiliation that it had not been able to happen at all. And I think this is caught. There's a brief television clip I once saw of President Bush speaking to a crowd at the ruins of the World Trade Center. And he said, "I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear us all soon." In other words, we will hit back at them, we will expunge the humiliation by hitting them. And so, of course, the cycle of violence continued. Bombs dropped on Afghanistan, interestingly with NYPD, New York Police Department, initials painted on them, so that that's where the message could come. This is the revenge. The attack on Iraq, falsely seen as relevant to the war on terror, was also part of the cycle of violence. And then, of course, there were the retaliatory bombings in Madrid and in London. Now, whatever the ethics of terrorism, there's a real threat, and we need to think about the ethics of different ways of resisting that threat. I want now to turn to torture. Although torture is much practiced, hugely practiced throughout the world to a horrifying degree, many countries are signed up to its absolute prohibition. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 5, says, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment." No one. There isn't any qualification about circumstances or the threat. No one shall be subjected to torture. Then the Convention Against Torture, Article 2, no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency, may be invoked as a justification of torture. Now, these statements appear to grant people an absolute right not to be tortured, a right independent of the laws of any particular country, a right not to be overridden in any circumstances. In the phrases Bentham attacked, you could say that these are natural rights, imprescriptible rights, which he, of course, would say are rhetorical nonsense, nonsense upon stilts. Now, I am in many ways sympathetic to Bentham, but I want to defend the doctrines of Article 5 of the Universal Declaration and Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture. The phrase I want to use, what I want to say about torture is that I want to see it off the menu. In other words, I want to see it excluded from the policy options. And to do this, of course, I need to respond to the ticking bomb case, to, and if you like, Bentham's arson case, but I think I'll stick with the ticking bomb case. It's more vivid now. I think the ticking bomb case is a very, very serious challenge. I don't think it's a frivolous argument just to be dismissed, but I want to try to give some reasons for resisting it. To people, and I think there's a problem, because the temptation is simply to say there's a deontological objection, there's a duty which isn't rooted in consequences for human beings and their well-being, their flourishing, their interests, their needs, and so on. But I am always troubled by that sort of line, because to those who have moral rules and prohibitions which are not rooted in people and their needs and their interests, there's always a powerful utilitarian challenge. If your conscience tells you not to torture in the ticking bomb case, how can you justify putting your reluctance before the lives of many thousands of people? And I think that's a deep and serious challenge, very hard, much harder to meet than, as it were, most Guardian readers of whom I'm one might think. I find this response is overwhelming, where the prohibition is just based on the person's own feelings, the person's own sense of moral identity, or on the commands of some authority, for instance, religious commands. In those sorts of cases, I want to say, yes, but whatever weight you give to that, surely it doesn't override the horrors of a nuclear explosion in a major metropolis. So I want to attempt a defense of keeping torture off the menu that's based on human needs and interests. I will hope to show that the exclusion isn't the effusion of a hard heart operating on a cloudy mind, but could come from the fusion of a soft heart and a clear mind. Now, in the ticking bomb case, I think let's take the most favourable case to it, which is where it's actually succeeded. Suppose that there is a terrorist. The terrorist has been arrested. He refused to tell you the details about the nuclear bomb. He was then tortured. Then he did tell the details about the nuclear bomb, and as a result, the bomb was defused. Now, I think that is a conceivable state of affairs. It's a conceivable scenario. And I have to say that in that case, I would find it very difficult afterwards to say, what a pity, what a terrible thing that they didn't just leave the man because so many people would have been blown up. So I have to accept, given what I've just said, I have to accept that there are conceivable cases where torture would be the lesser evil. In this thought experiment, as I've just set it up, I think it would be very hard to deny. Some people would heroically, but I think it would not be very morally plausible to say if only they'd not tortured, that would have been so much better. But I think there are huge limitations on these thought experiments. I love these thought experiments. Anyone who teaches philosophy, anyone who likes philosophy loves them. They're fun. They're a tool for exploring people's values. You know, we say, a very simple example, when we talk about capital punishment, people tend to say, but it's not a deterrent, and so we don't need to argue about it. But I want to say, supposing it was a deterrent, because I want to get at what people's deeper values are in the difficult cases. So I love these thought experiments, but I think there's a huge danger in taking them as a simple guide to reality, once one's used them, to tease out people's values. I mean, so much in recent times, particularly in the neocon literature about torture in the United States, has been conducted in terms of the ticking bomb, when the reality is cases like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. Now, let me make some points about why I think this wildly optimistic scenario for the ticking bomb case isn't really at all likely to be realistic. In the first place, torture is not a good source of information. People may say anything to stop the pain, I'm sure I would. Craig Murray, who was once British ambassador in Uzbekistan, until he was removed for speaking out about this kind of thing, once wrote about being present in Uzbekistan at the trial of an old man. This is what Craig Murray wrote. 2 of his children had been tortured in front of him, and he signed a confession on the family's links to Bin Laden. Tears were streaming down his face. I have no doubt that they have as much connection to Bin Laden as I do. Well, that's the argument, that's a suggestion that the assumptions of the thought experiment are wildly optimistic about it as a source of reliable information. It's not that it couldn't possibly generate reliable information, but it seems wildly unlikely. But I want to make a more positive case against torture, not just that it doesn't work, because even if it did work, I would want to say further things. The first thing is that it's likely to make the cycle of humiliation and violence worse. If you accept some picture broadly like the one I pictured about the cycle of violence between terrorists and those following up what they call the war on terror, if I'm right that part of the action on both sides stems from humiliation, it's hard to see how torture can fail to increase and deepen the sense of humiliation. Take something from both sides. On the one hand, what I regard as a mode of torture, the public parading and beheading of American prisoners by people on the Bin Laden side. What sort of reaction did they imagine that would have among the American public? I don't think that kind of thing would make the Americans I know say, oh, we can't have this, we'd better cave in at once, stop the war on terror. I believe people would feel humiliated, that their fellow citizens were being treated in this way, enraged and angered, and want to get back. Then again, the humiliations, on the other side, the humiliations of Iraqi citizens in Abu Ghraib, and indeed in its less publicised British equivalent, Camp Breadbasket. I mention Camp Breadbasket because I think there's a rather regrettable tendency that we in this country have of, as it were, remembering atrocities carried out by Americans, partly because America is in certain ways a much more free information society than we are. People tend to remember atrocities Americans have done, and not so many people remember Camp Breadbasket, which was a rather similar affair. So first then it's likely to make the cycle of humiliation and violence worse. Now I turn to the effects on victims. Again, one of the things which I think is important is it's also hard in talking about these things to know what degree of detail to go into. And when I wrote a book on 20th century atrocities, I found that an extraordinarily difficult judgment to call. Because on the one hand, there's a kind of sensationalist excitement that some people feel when they read descriptions of atrocities, and I didn't want to feed that. On the other hand, if you don't put in anything about, for instance, when I was writing about the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, I gave quite a bit of detail about the horrors of what it had been like to live through that bombing raid, the dropping of the bomb. And I did that because if you don't give detail, it's too easy for people to do their casual calculation and say, well, it very likely shortened the war, so we go for it. I wanted to make it difficult for people to do that. But the difficulty is you want at least to put balance on both sides. I was struck, though, that in my book I failed on both counts, because on the one hand, one tough-minded realist, a former Conservative cabinet minister, wrote an article in an American neocon journal mentioning my views. He wrote a review of the book in this journal and mentioned my views on dropping the bomb and said, well, that just shows he doesn't have any sense of proportion. Really, it's so obviously worth it. So I felt I probably hadn't put in enough detail about what the human costs were. Whereas on the other hand, some idiot at the London Review of Books wrote a hostile review saying my book read like a kind of pornography of cruelty. So you can't win. It's very hard to get it right, but I think there is a balance to be struck, and I probably won't get it right now. The effects on victims of torture. Some of them I think we can scarcely imagine. For instance, I certainly can't put myself easily into the experience, what it would be like, of Yasser Essam Hamdi, who was kept in solitary confinement in a United States military brig, and for years wasn't allowed even to kick a ball, for months was deprived totally of natural light, and his guards thought that he had been driven nearly insane. People often say rhetorically and emptily, oh, it drives me mad. His guards really thought that he was becoming on the edge of insanity. Or again, there's another torture victim in Guantanamo who made 8 suicide attempts. I cannot imagine the state he must have been in to be driven to that. But we can, on the other hand, a bit learn from the victims. Although it's hard to imagine these horrendous experiences we haven't had, we can learn a bit. For instance, the Jean Amery, who was tortured by the Nazis in Belgium during the Second World War. He said, I dare to say that torture is the most horrible event a human being can retain within himself. He said that the pain couldn't be described, but there was also an additional element of total defenselessness. He said the first blow brings home to the prisoner that he is helpless. They are permitted to punch me in the face. They will do with me what they want. And as a result, the victim has the long-term effect of losing trust in the world. And he says that most of us in life just take for granted, we hardly even realize it, the confidence we have that other people will respect our boundaries. He said, Jean Amery says, there's the confidence that another person will spare me. More precisely stated, that he will respect my physical and with it also my metaphysical being. The boundaries of my body are also the boundaries of myself. At the first blow, however, this trust in the world breaks down. And he says the change is permanent. 22 years later, I am still dangling over the ground by dislocated arms, panting and accusing myself. The tortured person never ceases to be amazed that his soul or his mind or his consciousness are destroyed when there's that cracking and splintering in the shoulder joints. Whoever has succumbed to torture can no longer feel at home in the world. well, I won't go on with the horrors, but I think one needs to, as it were, confront a description like that if one seriously to discuss what kind of justification there might be for engaging in torture. Then there's what it does to torturers themselves. Jean Amery again talks a bit about this. He says of his torturers, they placed torture in their service, but even more fervently they were its servants. In the world of torture, man exists only by ruining the other person standing in front of him. But others come close to being ruined themselves. Justine Sharrock has done interviews over the last few years of people coming back, soldiers coming back from Iraq, who've taken part in some of these horrors. And she says she found them young men hiding their regrets from neighbours who wanted to celebrate them as war heroes. They seemed relieved to talk with me about things no one else wanted to hear, not just about the acts themselves, but also about the guilt, pain and anger they felt, along with the pride and righteousness about their service. One of them, Ben, an American Army prison guard, had kept prisoners in a container. The temperature inside was sometimes 135 or even 145 degrees. He kept them blindfolded, hands tied behind backs, sometimes standing in awkward positions for up to 48 hours at a time, sometimes blaring loud music or banging on the container so that they wouldn't sleep. Once he made a verbal complaint about abuses, but nothing happened. He tried to mitigate the treatment, but I could only do so much. After one particularly horrible episode, he hid behind a building and cried. It was like a loss of humanity, he said afterwards. Back in America, he had nightmares and sometimes woke up in the night shouting. He couldn't remember things, and he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's what it does to the victims, there's what it contributes to the cycle of violence, there's what it does to the people who have to carry out the policies, and finally, more generally, there's what it does to society. In the first place, torture is, I think, associated with a certain kind of human callousness. The cold joke, there's a thing which when I was writing about 20th century atrocities, I found over and over again, and there were similar jokes that people made of a cold, humorless kind. Cold, we don't laugh with warm laughter, a kind of cruel joke. It's showing that you're in charge, you're the one with power, and they are totally at your mercy and humiliated. The cold joke, sure enough, surfaced in the War on Terror. I'm sure it surfaced on the other side too, but as I don't read Arabic, I don't have access to that. But for instance, Donald Rumsfeld on Guantanamo, when he was asked whether the conditions were humane, he said, "It's not meant to be a country club." Then Vice President Cheney said of the people in Guantanamo, "They're lucky to be in the tropics." And then there's the phrase used by the people running Guantanamo to describe the cruelties of sleep deprivation, where it's called the frequent flyer program. Now, this kind of thing, I think when one hears this kind of phrase, alarm bells ought to ring. It's a real sign of a society growing a kind of growth within it of a certain kind of inhumanity. Then again, there's evasiveness and the smokescreen. There's the shifty evasiveness, the verbal twisting by means of which the Bush administration tried to avoid the word torture. There are the euphemisms, extraordinary rendition, and so on, that call for a George Orwell to do them justice. This is all part of the smokescreen, which I think comes from an embarrassment about being found out. In 2002, Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver said at a meeting in Guantanamo that we may have to curb the harsher operations while the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, is around. It's better not to expose them to any controversial techniques. I think that the embarrassment about being investigated and scrutinized when you're doing this kind of thing is a faint residue of the abandoned moral revulsion against carrying out torture at all. Now the smokescreen, to avoid the embarrassment of exposure, is maintained sometimes at great cost to others. To take a thing reported just last month, Bentham Mohammed faces the death penalty after confessing at Guantanamo to terrorist offences. His defence that his confession was the result of torture is frustrated by official refusal to reveal the contents of relevant documents. And in Britain last month, the High Court said the refusal was deeply disturbing and had no rational basis. And Mr. Mohammed's lawyers said that the reason for the refusal was that torturers do not readily hand over evidence of their conduct. And the court said that this claim couldn't be dismissed and required an answer, and that the United States had not explained its refusal despite ample time to do so. So there, the smokescreen is actually harming the defence of this man whose life is at stake. I think, ever since reading Susan Sontag's book Illness as Metaphor, I've always been a bit suspicious of metaphors using illness, but I think that I am hugely drawn to the metaphor of torture as an infection not easily contained. Because it's striking that people who defend torture, and Bentham said, of course you have to hedge it around with restrictions to prevent abuse. People often say, we'll just have a little torture and then we'll stop, just to cope with the present crisis. We'll only torture when there's the ticking bomb, or we'll only torture when there's the real terrorist threat. People imagine that the social machinery of killing or torture, set up to deal with some real or imagined emergency, will be easy to dismantle. Jacobo Timmerman, after his own experience of torture in Argentina, saw the illusion of containment as part of a general pattern. There was what he called the great silence, which appears, he's talking about Argentina, and it's how the public responded to the knowledge of torture. The great silence, which appears in every civilized country that passively accepts the inevitability of violence. The silence which can transform any nation into an accomplice. That silence which existed in Germany, when even many well-intentioned individuals assumed that everything would return to normal once Hitler finished with the communists and the Jews. Or when the Russians assumed that everything would return to normal once Stalin had eliminated the Trotskyites. I think just thinking about the way in which people deceive themselves should make one very careful about accepting that this limited insertion of torture into our society is something which we can easily contain. Then there's also the complicit bystanders. There are so many people who know, or half know, sometimes fully know, about the torture that's going on, but for one reason or another are silent about it in a way that amounts to complicity. And here I'm going to concentrate particularly on British complicit bystanders in the torture involved in the War on Terror. Some people from British intelligence were present at interrogations in Guantanamo. An official of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office lied to Moazzam Beg's family that he was fine, and, as they put it, well treated in Guantanamo. The lawyer for Martin Mubanka's family said that the family has been told he's made allegations of mistreatment, but the Foreign Office refuses to say what they are. There are times when I think that the Foreign Office would be my second candidate after the Home Office for shutting down. In 2005, the then Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, was asked in Parliament about the use of British airports for American so-called extraordinary rendition flights. And he said that careful research by officials had failed to find any request for this by the Bush administration. He refused to say what MI5 and MI6 knew about such flights, because it was government policy not to comment on intelligence matters. Well, in the same debate, the Armed Forces Minister, Adam Ingram, was asked to say how many times two specific aircraft, whose numbers were given, which were suspected of being used for these flights, he was asked to say how many times they'd landed in Britain. and he said the information wasn't available. Now, it might seem important to investigate the issue of our country's possible complicity, involvement in torture. But when Mr. Ingram was asked as minister to check the records to find out about these landings, he said it would involve disproportionate cost. Now, as I say, want to keep torture off the menu. If there are human rights, and I've said I'm myself ambivalent, I kind of can't live with human rights and can't live without them. I certainly don't want to, as it were, rubbish them if that means that it's okay for people to be tortured and arbitrarily arrested and so on. But I'm uneasy about the theoretical basis. But if there are human rights, the most plausible basis for them is that some things are so precious to people that they should be protected, and not being tortured is surely a prime candidate. But even apart from rights, I've been hoping to make a powerful consequentialist case for keeping torture off the menu. It seems to me keeping it off the menu, and the model I have in mind is murder. Now, if you think about murder, it's easy to construct a thought experiment where murdering someone might be the lesser evil. If you happen to know that this, if you're allowed to play fast and loose with ordinary factual constraints, if you happen to know that this nasty little 11-year-old boy is going to grow up to be Adolf Hitler, maybe murdering him is the lesser evil. Of course, we never do know that. But I think it's easier to construct, again, rather implausible thought experiments. But some of you may remember Dr. Shipman, who managed to murder, I think, well over 100, was it even several hundred, I forget, of his patients. Certainly a vast number of his patients. So, I can construct a thought experiment in which somebody finds out that he's doing this, but he's destroyed the evidence. And so they have no hope of proving it. And let's suppose that the person who finds it out has also discovered, is also known to have a history of paranoia diagnosed by psychiatrists. So nobody's going to believe you anyway. Now, in this kind of thought experiment, I can imagine, yes, it might be the lesser evil to murder Shipman rather than let him carry on murdering lots of other people. But that's, again, a feature, it's an artifact of the weird scenario of the thought experiment. In real life, I don't want people to be, as it were, calculating when it's okay to murder someone they know and when they don't. I think we all live in a better world, in a safer world, a morally better world, where for most of us it's simply off the menu altogether. We simply don't consider it as an option. And I want torture to be like that. In each case, the thought experiment is too weak and the evidence is too thin to put against the real horrors of allowing the acceptability to be widely accepted that either murder or torture is a legitimate policy. Now, Bentham's own discussion, and I'll just return to Bentham but this is the very end of my talk. Bentham's own discussion seems to me very remote from any awareness of what torture is actually like. It's extraordinary bloodless account, should I say. And I like to think, because I'm a bit of a fan of Bentham, I like to think that with the accounts that are now available to us, the benevolent genius of this college might have come to a more generous utilitarianism and added to the many progressive causes he supported the abolition of torture.
I wonder if you think there are any other things that ought to be absolutely off the personal agenda of a humanist.
Well, I did say murder, not just of a humanist, but for anyone. What I'm not doing is saying I'm giving up on the approach that consequences ultimately what matter. I'm saying that pushing something off the menu may have better consequences than leaving it on and up to our judgment. It's an empirical question, what things actually fit that. But I think I would certainly put both murder and torture. I think sadistic acts to children, I mean, various things of that sort I suppose I would go for. But I mean, I would go for things which involve horrendous cruelty or deep destruction of something so major as human life, rather than the other things.
Yeah. To say that it's empirical implies that the right tool for investigating it is science rather than philosophy. Do you know of any scientific endeavours aimed at answering those questions empirically?
Well, firstly, let me say that the empirical question is undoubtedly something for science. I think science and philosophy should work hand in hand here. So I think philosophy ought to be discussing what the questions we need answering are and so on. But I'm not hugely good on the social. That's a euphemistic way of putting it. I'm lousy at the social science stuff. But I bet there is stuff on the effects of this.
Thank you, Richard.
What's the substance of your metaphor off the menu? When you used it very early on in the argument, you glossed it, I think, as it should be excluded from policy options.
Yes.
And a lot of the substance of your arguments rested on taking cases where torture as a social institution has this kind of corrosive effect and so on. Talking about Guantanamo Bay examples and so on. And I mean, I think some people have argued, well, once you start thinking about torture as an institution, you see that as such it's intolerable and unacceptable, and that might leave in place the idea with the ticking bomb thought experiment that in terms of individual isolated actions, we can imagine a conceivable case, as you put it, where it might be the right thing to do. So off the menu there, I take it, would mean, when we're talking about the way in which society operates, we see it as something that ought to be excluded from the social machinery, to use another phrase that you used. But you also sometimes, towards the end, seem to offer a stronger gloss on off the menu of a sort of, rule of thumb utilitarian kind. As individuals, we should, not allow for the possibility that it might even ever be conceivable.
Yeah, I actually want both. It's easier it's easier to defend the institutional one, because institutions which allow torture have all the horrible baggage that I've been describing and that we've seen so clearly in recent years. In the individual case, it's harder to defend, but I think I want to say that the chances of getting it wrong, if I imagine there I am, believing myself to be confronted with a terrorist who can tell me about the ticking bomb, I think the chances of my getting it wrong are so high that I would want to say, don't do it, even as an individual.
Not so much a philosophical question, but early on in your lecture you talked about the beheadings of American prisoners of war.
Yes.
And you said that you didn't see that it was going to impact upon the American public or public perception to withdraw the troops. When you look at Somalia in '94, when they dragged the bodies, that did have the effect. Do you think it was because one was a humanitarian effort and one was more of an economic war, or why do you think there was a difference in the moral outrage?
Your point is a very powerful one. I hadn't thought of that parallel, and I'm not sure what the answer to your question is. Obviously, it could be that I'm wrong about the reaction to the beheadings, but I don't think I am. I mean, I seem to remember being in America at some time when that was going on and getting a huge sense of anger and outrage rather than willingness to withdraw. It may be something about the commitment to the war. I mean, the Somalia thing, I think, was a UN humanitarian thing, and it may be they weren't so patriotically involved. I'm not sure, but I can spin answers off my head, but I don't actually know what the real answers are.
Thank you.
I agree with you absolutely about torture. I wonder if you couldn't make the case for an occasional short, sharp assassination on consequentialist grounds. You mentioned you couldn't kill an 11-year-old boy on the assumption that he would turn into Hitler, but if someone had assassinated Hitler, the adult, would that have been a bad thing to do?
I think I'm going to have to give way a bit. Yes, I mean, yes, or Mugabe. The problem is that it's an incredibly difficult question, because in one way, if we just say, yes, let's, especially somebody said, should we, I have the chance to assassinate Mugabe, should I do so? It would be hugely tempting to say, look, he's causing such misery, for God's sake, get rid of him by any means and shoot him if necessary. But the problem with that, and I really find it difficult, we don't have an easy answer. The problem with that is that once you allow it in, that kind of thing spreads. So that you get, the problem Israel has had with, for instance, the so-called targeted killings. I mean, Israel is a very interesting case study in both these issues, because both torture and targeted killings have been allowed in. In the extreme cases, it might be conceivable that they'd be the lesser evil, but what the Israelis seem to have found is that once you allow this kind of thing in, it's actually very hard to contain it. I mean, on the torture issue, there was a thing called the Landau report, in which it was argued that some kinds of physical pressure could be legitimate in an extreme case, in an emergency. They were very severely limited. Later on, the Supreme Court gave a ruling on it, the Israeli Supreme Court gave a ruling on it, and they found that Judge Landau, who was head of the committee which wrote the original report, said that he was struck and saddened, that he felt betrayed by the fact that the limits he had suggested had been broken through. That's the kind of thing that happens. So that, yes, just think about assassinating Hitler, it sounds fine. Assassinating Mugabe, it sounds fine too. But think about the long-term implications of it. It becomes, I think, a much more difficult problem.
Yeah, really showing my patriotism, but my absolute amazement and horror of finding out it wasn't just the American soldiers involved in the torture in Iraq, for example, but the British soldiers were involved in it as well. And for me, I thought it really was off the menu for British soldiers. And I just think that in a way where we have international conventions where we stand against it, where I cannot imagine there'd be many British politicians who would stand up and say, even in extremism, it is acceptable, when it is off the menu in terms of policy, internationally, nationally, through Europe, where you have all these things. Can it ever really be got rid of? Where technically, where all those policy things are in place, where philosophically people can agree that this is wrong, but it still takes place, and it still takes place but by countries like ours, which I'm sure most people would find absolutely abhorrent and may well have shared my amazement.
Yes. Well, first, may I say that since you're very patriotic, I really do. I do congratulate you on being, as it were, being in denial about this. You're willing to accept it, because quite a lot of people, if they're very patriotic, so it can't be true. And I similarly know Israelis who say, oh, it can't be true, no Israeli, whatever, and so on. Everybody thinks it about their own country. But I think it is very hard to contain this kind of thing. One of the problems with both Abu Ghraib and Camp Breadbasket is they take place in context of war. One of the things which I think is really bad is that our picture of war is inevitably sanitized, so that when we sign up for a war, and most of us in this room, I should guess, most of you humanists, probably weren't very keen on the Iraq war from the very beginning. So we can all be smirking away. But I'm struck that when people think about, is this war justified or not? People think so simply and so crudely. Saddam Hussein needs to kick up the backside of this kind of thinking. What people usually don't have is the thing. Bertrand Russell, when he was in prison for opposing the First World War, as a pacifist about that war, he said that people thinking about war tend to think in legalistic terms. People think in terms of, has such and such frontier been crossed, did so and so break such and such an agreement, and so on. What is missing so often is what he calls the vital, imaginative realization of the consequences of war. One of the consequences of war is indeed that very, very often young men, in America they're astonished at the time of My Lai in the Vietnam War. In most countries, we're brought up on films which demonize the Nazis and show them carrying out atrocities. Quite rightly, they deserve to be demonized, if anyone does. But we all think that this is rare and unusual. It isn't. When we go to war, we're taking the risk this kind of thing will happen. It's something which ought to be weighed in the balance when we're thinking about whether a war is justified. Can we stop it? We should go on fighting against it, but I'm not sure. It's incredibly difficult to stop this kind of thing.
Okay, we have many, many questions.
You were trying to minimise the difference between war and terrorism, and just ask you how far you would take that.
Okay.
How far are you dismissing the effects on that lack of difference of democratic decision-making, justification, just wars of arguments, that sort of thing?
Well, of course I don't want to say that wars are never justified, or that terrorism is always or even often justified. The differences are important, but so are the similarities. The differences are, first, the terrorism, I take it by definition, is deliberate targeting of civilians. Because in theory, the just war theory says you're not allowed to target civilians. So that there seem to be two differences with terrorism and, as it were, the ideal version of war. One is that civilians are deliberately targeted by terrorists, and that makes a big moral difference in my view. And the other is that war is declared officially by some competent authority, whereas terrorism is a hole-in-corner affair without any official backing. And I want to say the first is very important, although of course often in war civilians are deliberately targeted too. If I can offend British patriotism again. The Allied, particularly British bombing policy in the Second World War seems to me to have involved, not in all stages of the war, but towards the end of the war, seems to have involved the deliberate targeting of civilians, and so in a sense is morally equivalent to terrorism on that score. But I think that matters a lot, and so since all terrorism is deliberately targeting civilians, that makes terrorism in general bad, although not inconceivable to be justified, but very, very hard to justify. The fact that it's official matters much less to me. I agree that in an ideal democracy, and where it's been gone through with proper procedures, and we've checked with the UN that we actually do have a case and all the rest of it, properly checked as against rigged votes in the Security Council, then I agree that matters. But for the most part, I believe that whether a country goes to war or not is often very independent of these things. I mean, I would like to see, and I think one of the things we should be campaigning for is a much stronger version of the UN, so that when people wanted to go to war, they would have to justify a case to a UN court or committee or whatever to show that they really did meet the criteria in international law. It seems to me not good enough to say that what you're doing fits international law on the say-so of an Attorney General who a week before thought something utterly different. But I would like to see a system where, I'm struck by the contrast. If you want to get a grant to do a piece of medical research, you have to go through enormous hoops in order to show that all the ethics have been met and satisfied, and consent is genuine and fully informed and all the rest of it. You want to go to war and you barge in with President Bush and you get away with it. It seems to me it's scandalously disproportionate, and here I want to say institutional reform is absolutely crucial.
Last question.
When you were talking about dark sides, I remember about that paper written by Professor David Kennedy, which pissed off everybody who deals with human rights, where he said that human rights movement itself is a part of the problem. And he pointed out that the more we campaign for human rights, the more problems like torture occur, because the first thing that which they take into account in the policy is how many other human rights can we uphold by torturing this one person. So what would be your view on this?
Well, I think that kind of argument, I mean, I'm a bit sceptical about it really, although I'm a bit sceptical about rights, and I'm a bit sceptical that the argument you described, let's justify torture by saying it's a minor rights violation to protect a more major or a larger number of people's rights. That same argument can take place without the use of the word rights. It can take place on a utilitarian basis just as well. There are many, many people whose interests are affected. So I think it's a bit unfair to clobber rights with that particular line of thought.